It's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning, who is another social scientist, Elaine Ecklund, who joins us from Rice University in Houston, Texas. Elaine is a professor of sociology at Rice and the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences. She's director of Religion and Public Life, the Religion and Public Life Program, and co-director of the Boniuk Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance. She did her PhD in Cornell in 2004. She's spoken before at the Faraday Institute. We're very happy to have her back this year. She's very recently hosted Amy Unsworth, one of our colleagues here at the Institute, as a visiting research fellow in Rice. So it's great to have you with us this time, Elaine. So welcome.
I am going to present some overview material in the study that I've been working on for the past 4 years, trying to understand scientists' views, attitudes towards, conflicts with, collaboration with religious identities and sensibilities of all sorts. And that's a sort of a lofty goal. And 4 years ago, when I got the grant along with co-PIs Kirsten Matthews and Stephen Lewis at Rice University, I felt very good that we had support to do this large study. 4 years later, I think our research team feels overwhelmed and deeply humbled by the process. It's been quite a run, and we're very thankful. And I want to start first by thanking the Faraday Institute. Dennis Alexander, in particular, really encouraged me to do this research, to take my research on the religious identities of scientists in the U.S. in a more cross-national perspective, and I'm very grateful to Dennis for that encouragement. And I have just enjoyed so much being part of the Faraday Institute these past years and have benefited immensely from the work of Hillary and all of the staff of the Faraday Institute. You've really just been a great encouragement to me. You have not only wonderful substantive work going on here, but also a real sense of intellectual community, which I think is very unusual in the academy. 101 people have worked on this study. This includes 3 postdoctoral fellows, 11 research staff, 12 subcontractors with language abilities that we needed in the study, 8 graduate students, and 67 undergraduate or university students at Rice University. I think a study like this, understanding scientists' own religious identities, is significant for 2 major reasons, which in this room we know, but I think also are worth repeating in a strong way. 5.8 billion individuals, or nearly 84% of the global population, are religious, so according to the most recent Pew report. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that in 2007, the global science and engineering workforce in OECD nations was 4.2 million. So there are many more people who consider themselves religious than there are working scientists. But I think it's very intuitive to all of us that any nation that wants to grow economically on the world stage is trying to grow its science and technology infrastructure. And these 2 entities are not distinct. They come together on the global stage often. And whether we like it or not, and some groups of people that I present this research to really don't want to see religion and science interact, and some do want to see religion and science interact. But for both groups, the reality is that the science and faith interface lives very large in the public imagination around the world, even as something to embrace or something to combat. We see this, of course, through Richard Dawkins' popularity, through the God delusion, which, of course, the UK has exported to the US. He may be even more popular in the US than the UK at this point. We have on the other side of things scientists, probably the most popular of which is Francis Collins, who's a very outspoken Christian, writing about his own faith in the language of God. So we have some autobiographical materials of scientists themselves talking about their religious identities. What we have less of course, is a more broad-based understanding of scientists' religious identities. We see religion and science coming onto the public stage in the United States, particularly over what we teach about evolution in public schools. This hit a real peak in the early 2000s, around 2005, when we had prominent court cases in the states about whether or not evolution should be taught instead of or alongside intelligent design. But we also see, of course, as we've heard, in Turkey there is intensive debate as well, and in other places around the world. Historians, philosophers, and theologians, I think, who study the science and religion interface would resoundingly tell us that there doesn't have to be a conflict between religion and science, that doesn't really make sense from a theological perspective or from a philosophical perspective or from a historical perspective. What sociologists and psychologists and anthropologists, I think, bring to the table of these discussions is that we can observe in everyday people's lives that there still is a conflict, that people, whether or not it's accurate, people do function and believe and practice as if there is a conflict between religion and science. And so then the social scientist's job becomes to understand the conditions under which that sense of a conflict flourishes, what its consequences are, how people instantiate it, how people practice it in their everyday lives. So we stand alongside those other disciplines, I think, in a very important way. We're very much informed by those disciplines, but stand alongside them in understanding what everyday people do with the religion and science interface, how they actually practice it and understand it. Let me tell you a little bit about this study at a glance. So we are studying here scientists in 8 international contexts. These are contexts, I'll list them here, which differ in their level of scientific infrastructure. They differ in the religious understandings and characteristics of their populace. They also differ in the relationship between the church and the state. They differ in the proportion of women in science in each of these nations, and gender is often very much attached to religiosity. So those are the nations that we studied: France, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States. We studied 2 disciplines in their entirety, all fields of biology and physics. These are disciplines which both historically and presently have been at the core of discussions about the science and faith interface, but in different kinds of ways. The way that this study started was a very, very large list of scientists. Actually, 61,020 was our final list of scientists, biologists and physicists, who ended up in our sampling frame. And I know we probably have different, we come from different disciplines here. So our sampling frame is just the entire universe of scientists who were eligible to participate in the study according to the criterion we chose. And I'm happy to talk to you more about that in greater detail later. That list was not just dropped from the sky. That's where those 67 university students came in. So they essentially stalked these scientists trying to find out contact information for them. So they would go onto websites and social media sites and any kind of public access information. We wanted to find emails and addresses for these scientists. Then we called departments. I had undergraduates who spoke different languages and were able to follow up with department administrators and try to find out good contact information for the scientists. From that list, we took a random sample with what we call oversamples. We wanted to say get enough women into the sample to make some kind of meaningful assessment of what, say, women physicists think about these issues. They're very underrepresented in most national contexts, so we took more women into the sample in some of the contexts. So 22,525 were surveyed, and 9,422 responded to the survey. I don't know how many of you have taken a survey, probably most of you have, but if you can kind of think about the format of a survey, surveys box people in, and I, as the researcher, choose the boxes, the range of categories that you may answer from, right? So I tell you your range of options when filling out the survey, and there are very particular methodological reasons we do that. With something as complicated as religion, and especially trying to understand religion in different national contexts, we didn't want to stop there. We also wanted to try to understand people's own native categories for religion, how they differ from person to person. Of course, especially how these national contexts differ. We can't assume that religion is understood in the same ways in the science community across all of these national contexts. So to that end, we got on planes, trains, in cars, and we did 609 in-depth interviews, which is a very large interview-based data collection. It was actually much harder than all of the steps that came previous to this one, although it shows up only as one line on that slide. Some of our central research questions, and these are sort of basic initial research questions that I thought would be most interesting to this particular group, but we have lots of articles that are in process, and we're just starting to do some very beginning stages of book writing. So there are lots of other questions we're asking with these studies, but these are some things I thought we would find interesting and that general publics usually are wrestling with. So globally, our scientists, specifically the physicists and biologists that we studied, secular people. There is the kind of assumption, probably you in this room have a more nuanced perspective on this, but I think they're still very prevalent, and this is borne out in studies I've done of the general US population at least, that there is an enormous assumption that scientists are secular people. If we think about the sociological forefather Max Weber talked about the concept of a carrier. So a characteristic of a group of people that becomes just completely synonymous with that group of people. They almost can't shake that identity that people view them in a particular way. And so over and over when we survey general populations, they seem to view scientists as secular people. To be a scientist is to be a secular person. And then a piece closely followed to that is this whole idea of atheism. So are scientists then, if they're secular, also atheists, and what proportion of them are atheists? So those kinds of things are easy to figure out. But we were also interested to know the possible, even if they are atheists, are they all atheists in the same way? So for those who are atheists, are there possible varieties of atheism, and what do those mean, say, with relationship to concepts like spirituality and religion? And we've done some very active thinking on that. Is the conflict paradigm for scientists empirically accurate? You could see the relationship between religion and science, even for highly religious scientists, in a variety of different ways. They might they might really view those things as in conflict, and they're just sort of always warring between these two identities. Or they might see them as separate, completely separate and isolated. There are lots of ways of viewing these things. So we investigated that. And then we wanted to know, in a more descriptive way, to what extent religion ever enters scientific work. So you might imagine that even for scientists who are not personally religious at all, that they might have to deal with religion in some way. Say they might have religious colleagues, they might have religious students, there might be religious publics that have some sort of ethical challenges to science based on their own religious identities. So we wanted very much to understand the range of ways that religion might enter scientific work in these different contexts. So here is a little bit more detail about our methods. This final number of scientists, 9,422, obscures a bit what it was like to do a survey in each of these national and regional contexts. So the response rate for the survey ranged from a low in both Taiwan and Turkey, and I'll explain that to you in a minute, to a high response in the US. 57% of scientists responded, which is a very high response rate in modern day survey research. And in Italy, 57% responded. We did pretty well in the UK as well, 50% responded, and then a range of other kinds of things. Even though, some of those numbers, we have a bunch of people who didn't respond. So as social scientists, we start to wonder, what are the characteristics of the people who didn't respond? Are they different than the people who did respond in a way that would have some sort of impact on your study? So what we are doing now is what's called non-respondent analyses, where we are trying to understand the range of ways that the people who didn't respond are different. Again, thanks to those undergraduate university students that I worked with, they also collected all kinds of information on the scientists when it was publicly available. So we have some pretty good demographic information that we can analyze alongside. So far, we're not finding much difference in non-respondents, but I can talk to you more about that in detail later as well. Our survey included 77 questions. Religion does not exist in a vacuum, but is related to other kinds of social identities and categories. So in this study, we also looked at ethics, gender kinds of issues, which has been really interesting, family life, how scientists understand religion in their families, how they think about their children and religious identity, the commercial application of science, which is coming onto the global stage as being a very big ethical issue for some. Related to some of these categories, we had in our final survey 45% biologists responded and 55% physicists. 69% of our survey respondents have a PhD. The others are graduate students. There's a very small number of cases where people are teaching as faculty without a PhD. That's quite unusual, but most of those who are not PhD holders are graduate students because we looked at scientists at all parts of the career, so from graduate students to full professors or the equivalent rank in country. 33% are women, and that is after a pretty massive oversample in some of the discipline and national contexts. 21% are foreign-born, and this is much higher in some of the nations and a little bit lower in some of the other nations. But that has quite an impact on the religious demographic of the science community, the high proportion of people who are traveling to work in science. That's a very interesting thing that I'm doing some writing about now. So we interviewed scientists, so we have this set of survey responses, and then we know from the survey how scientists identify themselves religiously. We know particular religious identities and practices, but we also asked them this blanket question about the extent to which they think of themselves as religious. And we liked this question as a way of breaking up the interview respondents because it had a similar kind of meaning across the national context. So there are very different religious traditions, very different religious practices, and this was a kind of common denominator question. It's really not perfect, and you should be critical, but with this kind of research, it's a good kind of overview question to ask people. So we want people who think of themselves as, quite religious, people who think of themselves, I'm just a little bit religious or spiritual, and I am really not religious. That category does not describe me. And then we took a random sample of people to interview based on those categories of religious, slightly religious, and non-religious, because we wanted a good representation of each of those groups. And we thought if we took a straight random sample, if we just took a bunch of people randomly selected from the survey to interview, that we might not, say, get enough religious scientists or enough scientists who think of themselves as slightly religious or non-religious. So we did 609 interviews. We did interviews in 7 different languages. I had a multilingual postdoctoral fellow who was a huge gift to this project, who knew both Hindi and Italian. Those are unusual languages to know at the same time, but and English, of course, and French. So he really just was great. We sent him all over the world. So 7 different languages, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the methodological difficulties of this project in a minute, and there's some comic things related to language. To give you another vantage point for the study, this resulted in approximately 12,180 pages of transcribed materials that we're working through now. So, and we still don't have everything transcribed. This is just what we have transcribed at this point. So there's a lot of data to work through. So let's look at the religiosity of scientists for a moment. So this is the proportion of biologists and physicists who identify as religious. So it doesn't, if you're looking for religious scientists, in some way this first set of national context doesn't appear to be anything to write home about. So in France, the most secular, 16% of scientists see themselves as religious. The United Kingdom, 27%. That was actually a little bit more than I thought it would be. The United States, 30%, and Hong Kong, 39%. But look here at Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, and India. Over 50% of scientists see themselves as religious people. So there's there's some differences among these national contexts. So maybe scientists are religious or not religious, but maybe the real question is how religious are they compared to the general population in those national contexts. That's another kind of way to cut this data. So we were able to look at that through replicating some of the questions on our survey from national surveys that have been done in these countries in the general population. So we used in particular the World Values Survey and the International Social Science Program to look at this question in particular. So if you can see the blue, I think you can see that, you'll see that generally speaking, scientists are less likely to identify as religious when compared to members of the general population. That is not always the case. So you can see in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, scientists are somewhat more likely than members of the general population to identify as religious. And we're doing even some additional follow-up interviewing in those two contexts to try to figure out more about why that might be the case. You'll see in some of the national contexts, the gap between scientists and the general population is smaller, and in some it's larger. So you might imagine the kinds of implications that might have for public dialogue between scientists and religious groups, for example, right? If there's more similarity, it might be easier to have conversation, or maybe conversation is not relevant because they're all on the same page. If there's less similarity, if there's a bigger gap, there might be more tension. So we can think about the implications even these very descriptive statistics have for public debates and public dialogue about the religion and science interface in these different national contexts. So just looking at the more religious and less religious in a different kind of way here. Okay. So then we move to understanding the particular religious traditions of scientists. So in India, we have 79% of scientists identifying as Hindu. That's actually pretty close to the general population. Of course, keeping in mind that religious identity is understood in different ways in these different contexts. So some of the scientists told me, you know, to be Indian is to be Hindu. I mean, there's controversy over whether that's actually the case. But of course, sometimes this is understood more as a cultural identity. Sometimes it's understood as a religious identity. So we have it understood in different ways. This is a similar sensibility in Italy, where to be Italian for some is to be Catholic. There's obviously a huge cultural prevalence of Catholicism in Italy. In Taiwan, we have 10% of scientists identifying as Protestant, and 17% each identifying as being Buddhists or practitioners of folk beliefs. In Turkey, 73% identify as Muslim. So then we look at other kinds of things as well about the extent to which people practice, how they understand those particular religious beliefs, those kinds of things. Another way we think about religiosity or religious identity is through practices. And here you have differences in these national contexts in what practice means, right? Some of the dominant religions in the particular national context are what we might call more organizational religions, where people go to a building to do something. Some are less organizationally based, and so you have to take that into account when you're interpreting these data, but it is one way to slice the data. There are pretty big practice differences in Italy. So you can see that 54% of the general population attend once a month or more, which is seen by social scientists who study religion pretty universally as quite regular practice if you do something once a month or more, depending on what the practice is. In the United States, there's a pretty big difference in organizational practice, where 44% of the general population attends once a month or more, compared to only 17% of scientists. In the United Kingdom, it's not as big a difference. No one's attending that much. So, you know, that's kind of something interesting to point out as well. France as well, no one is really attending that much. Taiwan, of course, we have a diversity of religions in Taiwan. There's a closer gap, as well as Hong Kong, there's a closer gap. I am a sociologist of religion by training, And if you had asked me, especially given that I had studied this topic in the United States, can scientists be religious? I would have told you, of course, they can be religious. It's a matter of how they are religious and the difference between the general population. So some of these results about religiosity have been indeed surprising to me, but not super surprising. What has been really interesting to me and has dispelled my own stereotypes, I think, is discovering the kind of intricacies in identity and practiced among atheist scientists, the kind of varieties of atheism that are out there in the scientific community. And that has been, I think, for me and for members of my research team, just a huge surprise. And we're doing a lot of writing now about the varieties of atheism and atheist identity, which I think is dispelling some common stereotypes that religious people have about atheists. So the general public, and I've studied this in the US, I think has a sort of monolithic understanding of atheism. They think that atheism is the same every place and everywhere. Really globally, I've asked different kinds of survey questions in the United States which get at this. I'm not aware of studies on this topic in other national contexts, but it will be something for some of you to pick up and study. Of course, we have some outspoken scientists who actually, put that idea out there very actively. Richard Dawkins said recently, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is the belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. So he, has sort of made no bones about it. He's, very anti-religious. And so it's not, the public, I know from other social science studies, when someone writes very actively, it appears in the public imagination as if the group is much larger than it really is. So it might be one person. I mean, there are certainly other scientists who think similarly to Dawkins. I don't want to convey that he's the only one. But it might be one person or a relatively small group of people who do a lot of writing, but then there's the resulting public impression that this group is very large. And that has definitely happened around this issue. So I've even asked survey questions like, what proportion of the general population, what proportion of scientists are atheists and things like that to get public perception of the scientific community. And there's a pretty convinced perspective amongst general population people in the United States that scientists are atheists. Like this is just, even if you, it's relatively difficult to dispel that, but hopefully this data will get at a deeper understanding. So we start by just trying to map descriptively scientists' attitudes towards what we call a convinced theism. So to what extent do you believe there is a God? So in France, interestingly, in the general population, we see, I think I may have that. So belief there is no God. I said that incorrectly. So in France, we see that 51% of scientists are convinced atheists. I meant it the opposite. So to what extent do you see yourself as a convinced atheist? I believe there is no God. In France, 51% of scientists see themselves as convinced atheists. And then I ordered the blue bar, which is scientists going down from there. In Turkey, only 6% of scientists are convinced atheists, for example. And then you see arranged among the other national contexts in the United States, 35% convinced atheists, in Hong Kong 26%, in Italy 20%, in Taiwan 11%, in India 11%, the United Kingdom 40% of scientists see themselves as convinced atheists. But this obscures, let me go back for a second, this obscures the kind of varieties of atheism that are present in this particular community, in the scientific community. So I am going to present to you 3 types of atheism that have emerged in our initial analyses of the interviews when we ask scientists about, in different ways, whether they're atheists, of course, but then what it means to not believe in God and how they understand that in relationship to religion and these kinds of things. We are discovering yet additional ways that scientists are atheists beyond these 3 categories, but these are the 3 that are most dominant in our interview analyses at this point. So there is a group of people who see themselves as spiritual atheists. So for an Italian professor of biology, it looks like this. He says, I think I am a spiritual person, but I'm not religious. Believing in spiritual matters like relationships, love, respect, romantic feelings even, or humanitarian feelings. So that is very spiritual. I believe that people should be happy. I believe that the world should improve. And he goes on to say he thinks his sense of spirituality is related to, but somewhat different than the kind of spirituality that someone who's deeply religious might have, and so he talked about that quite a bit. So this idea of spirituality and atheism being very connected. Scientists often made boundaries between colleague scientists who are atheists who are not spiritual, and they're sort of thinking of it as strict modernists, don't understand the aesthetic parts of life. So they had all kinds of ways of describing these scientists who are not spiritual atheists, which we thought was interesting. They tried to create that kind of boundary. There are also atheists who have what we would call religious or spiritual aspirations, that they want to be religious or spiritual and just can't seem to believe or practice. Here's a US professor of biology who says, let's put it this way, I aspire to be a spiritual person. To me, it's almost like a kind of a golden rule type of thing. It's sort of about aspiring to be good, not to be completely self-centered and have everything focused back on me and my own concerns. So maybe it's not a very high-level spiritual thinking because I don't really worry about these things like the afterlife. This was an older professor, a woman, who said that maybe she should start worrying about the afterlife at this point, but she couldn't seem to make herself, even though she's getting older. It's a very interesting interview. So for this group of scientists, it's not so much this really negative rejection against religion. It's more, I want to believe, but I just can't seem to make myself believe. And that's something we're investigating further. And then, particularly common in the UK, we have what we call church-going atheists. And this is often, we did not find this, interestingly, in contexts that are not predominantly Christian, and we're kind of working through why that might be the case. Here's a reader in physics who says, I have no problem going to church services like looking at another part of your culture, but I have no faith religiously. It doesn't worry me that religion is still out there. So this group of people, they're not virulent atheists, right, of the Dawkins type. They're people who feel pretty comfortable with religious people. Sometimes they have a spouse who's religious. There's different kinds of reasons that they give for being actively part of church communities. But that's something I think that dispels some stereotypes that some religious people in the general population might have of atheist scientists. So I give that to you. Then we wanted to talk a bit about the conflict paradigm and to what extent this is empirically accurate for the scientific community. So do these scientists see religion and science as being in conflict? So to begin with, we simply asked them. So we asked this following question, which is called a force response. So I give you a kind of hard view and then you respond to me. So for me personally, my understanding of science and religion can be described as a relationship of, and then conflict, I consider myself to be on the side of religion. I consider myself to be on the side of science. I'm not sure which side I'm on. They refer to different aspects of reality, this sort of non-overlapping view. Collaboration, they can be used to support the other, and then people who just don't know. So let me start with the independence view. They refer to different aspects of reality, which is the largest view, although there's a range here. So a relatively small proportion of scientists think this in Turkey, and quite a large proportion of scientists, interestingly, think this in Taiwan and Italy and France, national contexts which are pretty religiously different. So this is a pretty popular view. When we get into the interviews then, we can map their survey responses with what they say in the interviews and the kind of what we call the content of these perspectives. So you don't really know what independence means. You don't know what you think about those two spheres, whether you really like the science one and think the religion sphere is a little tiny, puny sphere and not very relevant to the world, but sure, it still exists. It's just separate from science. So when we get into the interviews, we can tell more about the content. Here's an associate professor of physics in Italy who says, no, there's no conflict. Science and religion are completely distinct because there's no connection between the physical reality described by science and the existence or not existence of God. Again, there's no intersection in the sense that science can explain. In other words, you will never be able to prove or disprove God. God is outside the reach and the limits of science. And this particular physicist was actually personally quite religious, but this is the way he kept those views. He separated them while still thinking each was important, or each sphere was important. Then there's a group of scientists. This is a smaller group, but still a significant minority, a relatively large minority in Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey, who advocate for a collaboration view, who think that science and faith can be used to help support the other. This is quite a small opinion in France. There's not very many scientists who think this. In Italy, the UK, and the US as well, there's this relatively small proportion of scientists. But I like this quote from an Indian professor of biology, which is somewhat typical, who says, yes, religion, you can say that inspires us to be disciplined, like we're having prayers, which have definite timings. This means you have to get up early in the morning for the first prayer, and then after that, late in the night. So that means there are 5 times which are fixed for the prayer. He's a Muslim. I mean, it's just one thing you can say, that if you're disciplined, so that is one of the important factors when you're doing science, if you're disciplined, that will definitely help you. I like this quote because it is not about belief systems. So I think the way that we've commonly thought about the collaboration between religion and science is entirely centered around substantive content of religion and substantive content of science. And so this scientist is emphasizing collaboration in terms of practice, and he went further, even sort of character development, things that he's learned in the course of practicing his faith have had a direct impact on his science through the type of person he is and how he's disciplined, and he went sort of on and on about that, the ways in which they collaborated almost at what I would call the interface of practice in a different sort of way than we usually. So I think there's a particular kind of Christian understanding of the science and religion interface which emphasizes beliefs and content of beliefs, and so this kind of sensibility helps us get outside of that and think a bit more broadly. How does religion enter science, or rather, does religion enter science? We shouldn't assume it does, and if so, how does it? And I was particularly interested for places in the world where there's a large group of non-religious scientists, like France. And does religion ever come up? Is this just a non-issue because there's such a small proportion of people in the general population and the science community who are personally religious? So here's some dominant ways that religion comes into the workplace. So I should say, first of all, it does seem to enter the science community in some places more than others. It enters through immigration. So in national contexts like the UK and France, which are doing better economically in terms of scientific infrastructure than some other national contexts like Italy, even Turkey, you see big immigration flows of scientists coming in. This is, I've mapped the immigration patterns of scientists compared to some other professional groups, and scientists are among the professions, if not the top profession, in terms of movement. So they tend to travel to do their work. When people travel across borders, they bring religious identities with them. And sometimes we know this in a kind of intuitive way from general population studies. Sometimes those religious identities are quite different than the dominant religious identity, the dominant secular identity of the general population that they're being received into. And sometimes increased religious diversity develops. Sometimes tension develops. There are all kinds of things that could happen. So that definitely happened in the science community, and scientists brought that up the most. Through ethics, scientists told us that often they rely on religious traditions, even religious traditions that they do not presently practice, when it comes to difficult ethical matters involving science. And this has a wide range from just making sure you don't lie about your research results, so those kind of very basic things, to how you treat people, how you deal with difficult issues related to the commercial application of science and power structures in science. And so there are lots of things that come up there through ethics, even for relatively non-religious scientists. And then through interface with the public. And this is another site. So immigration is interesting because these are scientists of different religious traditions coming into the science community itself. Scientists also interface with religion outside the scientific border, right? They interface with religion through the general public. Sometimes the general public in these particular national contexts bring religious challenges to science. Sometimes scientists are very dependent on the public for approval for funding streams. in democratic societies where there's a lot of government funding, those things are not necessarily synonymous. So let's think about how immigrants enter science. I love this picture, which was taken in France. So here is a physicist in France who said the following. I had an interview with a Muslim girl who wants to apply to come here. So I did an interview with her through Skype, but then I could see she was Muslim because she had the veil. We had a lab meeting, he means with the other people in his lab, and I said, okay, I interviewed this woman and stuff. She seems okay. And then I brought the issue that she was a Muslim with the veil. Some colleagues did not want that in the lab. They think it will interfere with the work. Now, there are different perspectives. I've given this information to audiences where there were French scientists present, so there's a lot to be said about laïcité and what it is and what it means for workplaces and things like that. But this was a very interesting situation. They did not end up hiring this woman. It were made very clear that's because she's a Muslim. And you see, but this is very common in France, that Muslim scientists are coming in to the scientific environment. It's also common in the UK. And these are national contexts where either religion is not practiced so much or practiced in what some might call a less robust form, and sort of how do they deal with people who seem to practice their religion more seriously, I put in air quotes. So then ethics is another big issue. So here's a UK professor of biology who says she's not particularly religious, but she says religion still provides a check on those occasions where you might be tempted to shortcut because you want to get something published and you think, oh, that experiment wasn't really good enough, but if I portray it in this way, then that will do. She says then she remembers her religious training as an Anglican, and she says, that this kind of provides a sensibility for me that helps me be a more ethical scientist, even though there is just enormous pressure to publish things quickly and in well-placed journals, and this sort of helps her with that. And thirdly, through interface with the public, here's another UK professor of biology who says, I work with food, and sometimes the research work would involve tasting or analyzing samples that might not be compatible with everyone's religious background. So if I knew that a number of my participants would prefer halal meat because that's what their religion suggests, we would try to source halal and be clean about it, or we would offer the choice not to participate if they feel that the samples are not compatible with their religious views. So here's quite a different perspective where the scientist is being accommodating in the study, not wanting to sort of inadvertently ostracize people who are part of a religion that she doesn't share. So that she talked a little bit about how she involved a diversity of people in her study. So she needed to actually interface with the public through the very research that she did, but there are other kinds of ways as well. I want to talk to you just briefly. How am I on time? I'm kind of running out? Okay. All right. Those were the research findings. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about some challenges of cross-national research on religion. I think some of you, I've noticed from informal conversations, are doing projects that involve social science. So one big challenge that we had was how we would design ideal questions. So that was one thing. Here's an example about belief in God. So from the World Values Survey, just as simply a yes-no question, do you believe in God, yes or no? And this was hugely problematic for some of the national contexts, interestingly, even that the World Values Survey asked this question of. ISSP version was much more nuanced. So just the larger point there is designing questions differently for different national contexts while keeping in tension that we want to compare across these national contexts, and that means we need to ask people the same questions to be able to compare. So that was a big deal. Let me skip through that. Getting people to participate was a big deal. It's very important to get a high response rate in survey research. That became a huge challenge for this study. So these are some of the things that we did to try to get people to participate. We actually sent them letters. 900 scientists wrote back to me about the study personally. So even though some of them didn't have time to participate, but they had time to write a long letter about why they did not participate. So We had, email reminders, phone call reminders. We did all sorts of respondent conversion. Sort of the highest form was one of the PIs getting on the phone with the scientist, and so we tried all kinds of things. We also gave financial incentives. We tried to pay them to participate, which is somewhat controversial depending on the national context. Sometimes we paid everyone ahead of time whether or not they participated, which is called the guilt incentive. Sometimes we said if they participated, then we would pay them after, right? So here's what the amount of money that we gave out in the US looks like in physical form. So these incentives were very challenging. So there's logistical things like what type of incentive. In some national contexts, it's easier to send cash through the mail than in others. It's not cheap. There are some national contexts where giving people money to do things appears coercive. I'll just read this one quote from a UK scientist who said, "I'm writing to ask if you could please remove my details from your database with immediate effect and refrain from contacting me. I have found the stream of correspondence and especially the unsolicited inclusion of clash very distressing. They left me feeling harassed and very uncomfortable. I do not wish to receive any further correspondence from you or any other member of their project team or agents acting on your behalf. I did not reply to the emails as first I thought they were spam or some kind of scam and did not wish to confirm my email address by replying." That was a minority, but we did get those from scientists. Here's an Indian scientist who says, "Thanks, Professor Ecklund. I have utilized it to buy a book, Big Bang, by Simon Singh for my son. Thanks again." So many other sort of different views in how the study should proceed. So I think we have just begun to leverage these data for what they can provide. So I've provided to you responses to 7 survey questions, and there are 77 on the survey. So it's just the beginning. But I do think that we dispel some myths here about scientists being secular. They are often less religious than the general population, but we do find cases where this is not true, and there is a strong religious minority in almost all of the national contexts. I really enjoy that this study moves beyond tired stereotypes of atheists, and I think ways that will be even more robust as we continue to analyze the data. We also start to problematize the conflict paradigm. And to understand, especially related to religion entering the workforce, that even if scientists think that religion and science should be kept completely separate, which many of them do, there are still conditions under which they have to have strategies to interface with the religion because they have no choice but to do so. And I think this study will start to provide some of the strategies that they use. So here are the ways in which it enters the public. Big questions remain, such as to what extent is the conflict model primarily a Western model? Under what conditions does conflict persist? What specific issues and in what social spaces does conflict between religion and science persist? How does the relationship between religion and science relate to other social phenomena? So we're just beginning to study that. Things like social class of scientists, and we have looked at the differences just in the very beginning piece of this study between scientists at elite contexts and science at less elite universities and research institutes. Something of interest to some people in this room, so how do people change their mind about the religion and science relationship? I think that's something that's interesting. And then a broader public kind of outreach question, under what conditions does social science scholarship on religion and science contribute to public discourse in helpful ways? So what kind of information do we need to get out there to dispel myths that are very prevalent in what kinds of publics, I think is a big question that this project has implications for. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much, Elaine. Fascinating talk, absolutely jam-packed with interesting stuff. So I'm sure we've got some good questions. Yes. Sorry, furthest away from the mic.
Yeah. Thank you. It was really fantastic talk. I looked at data, but my data is a little bit older, actually for another talk a few weeks ago. And did you look at age? Because when I was looking at statistics within the United States over the last like 20, 25 years, there was a difference between older scientists and younger scientists, which brought a question to me because most of our members in the National Academy of Science, which are our supposed scientific brain trust in America, are older people. And they purported in the late 1990s, when they were only looking at physicists and mathematicians, to have an entirely very high group of people that espouse atheism. And that seemed to hold when they looked in the early 2000s across a lot of scientists, that when you looked at age, here again, older people seem to be in the more atheistic, agnostic camp than the believer camp. Did you look at that too? I'd be real interested to know.
Yeah, so we ask scientists their age, and we also look at rank. So comparing the ability to compare graduate students to full professors, for example. And in another study I have completed of U.S. scientists, we also compared our data in the U.S. to earlier data collected among the scientific population, where we asked the same questions to replicate that data. So the two kinds of things, so a very short answer is that yes, in this study, in I think all of the national context so far, older scientists are at least a bit less religious than younger scientists. And so you then ask, is this a life course effect or a cohort effect, right? So is it that you enter science and just over time you become less religious? Or is it that there is a kind of change coming where, you know, younger scientists are slightly more interested in religion? I would say the effect is not enormous in magnitude. It's statistically significant, but it's not enormous. I think we would be wrong to say, my gosh, there's just a religious revival among younger scientists. I don't think that's quite the right way to interpret it. I find more evidence for the view that there is a change coming with younger scientists than I do for the view that you simply enter science and become less religious, in part because there is not the kind of change in religious identity as a result of learning more about science that I would have anticipated. So either in scientists' own perceptions, and if you compare, you know, the religions that I identify with, say at age 16 compared to what they identify with now, there's not as much change if you would anticipate if that's the case. So there's other kinds of evidence, I think, which inclines me to think that it's more of a cohort effect rather than a life course effect.
I was going to say, maybe it's just us grumpy old scientists, you know, we get more grumpy with old age and experiments don't work. No, that's not my question. So there was a comment.
I was thinking through how to test the hypothesis, but yeah.
My question actually is, I'm just wondering, and I know we've discussed this before, I wonder if any of these countries give scope for comparison with other professional groups, whatever, you know, whether there are data out there already, perhaps from other studies that might help in comparing scientific, because I'm, as you know, very interested in professionalization and the impact of that on, well, that sort of community, cross-community kind of comparison.
Yes, yes. So I have the most robust data on that topic in the U.S., where we have pretty fine-tuned occupational data that's publicly available, to a lesser extent the U.K. And Italy. Scientists do seem to be a bit different in kind than other professional groups which share similar levels of education. It's a little bit comparing apples to oranges because there's a particular kind of science. So scientists tend to have more education, so you can't exactly compare years of education in a direct kind of way, but what we have done so far is compare very highly educated people across different professional groups. So lawyers, for example, physicians are a weird group because they think of themselves partly as scientists and partly not. I mean, they're not natural scientists in the conventional sense, but that's an interesting group. Trying to think what else. I guess those two are the ones that are people who are in business, who have, say, masters in business administration or advanced degrees, other academic groups. And so there does seem to be something somewhat unique, although we haven't been able to compare that across all countries in the scientific community. And then there's some evidence, too, in the interview data for professional socialization, and I've been looking for that because you and I have talked about that quite a bit. And there is this evidence that scientists are pressured to privatize religion in particular kinds of ways. So this is it's related to the previous question, but it's not necessarily that they become personally less religious, but they do become privatized in particular ways, especially in the US, where we've looked at this so far, and in the UK. So that's...
Laurie?
Thank you. A really fascinating study. Of course, I want you to go to Israel and talk about that. But aside from that, I wondered if it would be different with other academic traditions, including actually religious studies professors. I wonder if you get the same kind of privatization of faith and the sort of the yearning for objectivity in other disciplines as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have studied the social sciences pretty broadly. I've studied psychology, anthropology. No, I've not studied, I'm sorry. I studied psychology, economics, and political science. And there is especially, here's where I think the elite university versus other kinds of universities, there is a pretty big effect there. And there's another colleague who is at University of British Columbia who has studied this topic as well and doesn't find really much disciplinary differences at universities that are not elite. Finds quite a bit of interdisciplinary differences between non-elite universities, between social and natural scientists, with social scientists actually being less religious than natural scientists. But at elite universities, social and natural scientists appear very similar, in my experience, at least in the United States. I don't have the capacity to answer that question across national context, but at least in the United States, that seems to be the case, with social scientists trying very hard to look like natural scientists. I mean, in terms of professional socialization, there's a real push in the social sciences to mirror the natural sciences, which I think is having a religious impact as well.
Yeah, question over here. Is it Francis, I think?
Thank you, Erin, for such a wonderful research, actually.
Thank you.
I'm not a social scientist, but I'm just wondering because when you say global perspectives, when I look at your study, to me it's more or less of the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is Hong Kong, well, more Western maybe than China, Italy, Turkey still. So I was wondering whether you would have looked at also the cultural traditions, because organized religion, for example, you find Italy would be more Catholic for reasons. They would go to church.
Mm-hmm.
Western world, the UK, France, probably more or less the same. US, religion is not really emphasized, and therefore people can choose to go or not to go. I would have loved to see more of the Muslim world, to get that perspective. Maybe African world, to not to just to see how faith impacts on, science impacts on faith, but also to see how faith impacts on science from the African perspective. Because maybe people may be more religious as become more scientists from African world, I don't know. So I would have loved to see a better milieu, a better mixture of the global perspective per se, because to me, your sample is the same. It's only that their parameters, perspectives, which may be informed by how religion is organized. I don't know.
I don't know if you're interested in this issue, but I hope you might pick it up if you are. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. You're entirely right, is the response I have to your question. So this study, I would say, selected national contexts which were feasible to study utilizing this methodology, which were most diverse. So I selected the group of national contexts that I could study using this methodology that had the broadest range of diversity. as far as I could tell, it would have been nearly impossible to carry out the study in this particular way in some of the national contexts you mentioned. That said, that means the study has pretty big limitations, right? And it shouldn't ever try to describe those national contexts. I like the way that you put it, the cultural traditions around which regions are organized. I think that's the right way to think about it. So then the next step, if you can see this is a first step towards mapping scientists' religious identities, I think the next step would be to look at African national contexts. There's some very initial work going on there at this point, and to look at South America, I think is very important as well. So those are the places where, if I were to continue doing this research, I'd want to try to get research partners or even give that to someone else. I mean, I'm not sure I would necessarily even be the right person to study that. You get into very complicated issues where you need to have someone who's on the ground who really understands what's going on. So, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more is my answer. Yeah.
Who's got the mic? I saw a hand from Javier, but have you still got one up? Yeah.
Very short question. Did you find any significant difference between physicists and biologists?
I know. If only I'd had 3 hours to speak. Why was I so limited? The answer is I had the same amount of time everyone else did. But, yes, and but it does differ among the national contexts. So in the UK, and we haven't even thrown in elite and non-elite status, which also makes a difference, and gender makes a difference in this regard as well. So in the UK, if we just compare physicists and biologists across all measures of religiosity, physicists tend to be a bit more religious. In the US, it makes no difference. Interestingly to me, because biologists have definitely been at the forefront of public discussion about religion and science recently. And so I would have thought that biologists would be less religious given the kinds of things that they write publicly, if that makes sense. But that was not the case in the United States. In Italy, they're pretty similar, and I don't think that we've really looked at the other national contexts and analyzed them in that way as much yet. But there are differences, but different in different national contexts, yeah.
Eleanor at the back has a question.
Thank you, Elaine. Really interesting. I just wondered, for example, France, does it make a difference if the country is secular? So if you're in France, for example, and that's a place I've lived, so I've experienced, I wouldn't talk about my faith at all in my workplace. Do you think that would have had a big impact? 'Cause I'm quite surprised by some of those figures. Do you think they just wouldn't want to discuss it at all, even though they're knowing that they're helping you with their study? So they leave the religion at home, and it really doesn't come into their workplace. Whereas in the UK, we'd probably be more open to discuss this.
Yeah, no, that's the right kind of question to ask. So this, related to religion, this study really has two kinds of dynamics. One is just what do scientists think at a personal level, right? And you know, what you think at a personal level has different kinds of consequences depending on what the religion is and how publicly your faith demands it be expressed, if that makes sense, right? And how your faith is received in that particular national context, what kinds of laws and even cultural dynamics are at play in terms of workplaces and things like that. So there's the personal part, but then there's the public expression of what's supposedly personal, if we even believe that faith is ever just personal, right? So if France was an interesting context, and the dynamic that you are claiming came out quite prominently in the methodology of the study. So scientists did not want to talk to us about religion. Even scientists who we found out later were actually religious. So we ended up starting the study, and I'm writing I may write a methods text about this because it's very interesting. We ended up starting the study as being a study about, you know, what scientists think about religion, which is how we presented the study to other scientists in other national contexts. No one would participate. So then we stopped that study And had a workshop day where we taught and invited some French scientists who I'm friends with to think with us about this. And then we decided to present the study to them as being about the social dynamics of science, which means nothing really. I mean, it's sort of, right, you're like, what does that mean? Is that a special sociology term? You know, it's just something Elaine made up. So we wrote, I can show it to you for anyone who's interested. I wrote this whole letter to them about the special study about the social dynamics of science. And that did work. We also had, we contacted department heads, laboratory heads, and we sort of had a very particular way of getting scientists to participate in France. France was very difficult, but we did end up with a pretty good response there. So.
Okay, the gentleman in the beige, and then Jim in front of him. And then we've run out of time, I think, after that.
Elaine, thank you. Isn't your study, what it's actually doing is getting you to the point where you actually come to the conclusion that actually religiosity has an impact on science? And of course, this is the bit Laurie's going to love, is that you've got a high proportion of Nobel Prize winners who happen to be Jewish, and much larger percentage of Nobel Prize winners who are Jewish than are not Jewish. So what it tells you is that religiosity actually does have an impact on science breakthroughs. But then you've got an interesting fact also that it doesn't necessarily appear in the generation which is religious, because if you they did a study in the Who's Who in the United States, and they discovered that 85% of the people appearing in Who's Who in the United States came from highly religious backgrounds, but they weren't necessarily religious themselves. So what you end up doing is you end up discovering that religiosity does have a huge impact. But what, of course, is quite odd is it doesn't always have an impact in the generation which is highly religious.
Yeah, so with social science methodology, you can certainly map the proportion of people who are Jewish who have Nobel Prizes with the proportion of Nobel Prize winners who are Jewish. You can certainly do that. What I would take a little bit of issue with is the causality inference. So we want to ask then, what is it about being Jewish that has an impact on likelihood of winning a Nobel Prize? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that I think is a very interesting question, right? So these data have implications for how content of religion has an impact on content of science, but I don't think can draw really conclusive kinds of results. I guess I.
It's not a question of being Jewish. It's simply that being Jewish in religiosity. It's not the question of being Jewish, but if you are Jewish, then your religiosity.
I don't really have anything that would. Right? Sure, that's plausible. Yeah, and
I'm going to run out of time, and let's hear his question before we finish.
Actually, is this data available to the general public, for example?
Yes.
It's already published, just that.
27 publications in play right now. I think we have maybe 2 that are actually published. I mean, so we have a couple of that are published. To you, given what I've just presented, in that they're very small slices of the data, but I'd be happy to share them and put them on any kind of platform that you want through the Faraday Institute. And I also will share this slideshow if people are interested, so I'll put that up as well. And I just did a conference in the US. I did one in the UK a year and a half ago, which just looked at the UK and India, which is publicly available. But then I also did one in the US, which presented these data, and we did a published conference report from that. And so I'll give that to the platform as well. So, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your interest in this. This was really terrific. So are we done now?
We are done. Thank you
okay.
very much.